You belong to me now. You're going to pretend to be my wife.
Bound by a desperate bargain, their fake marriage came with one ironclad condition: zero physical contact. Kevin only wanted a paper bride to save his mountain territory, and Flora simply needed a place to hide. But when a deadly winter storm traps them inside, keeping his distance becomes impossible. The mining camp of Leadville, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882, was no place for a woman alone. It was a chaotic scar on the side of the Rocky Mountains, smelling of sulfur, spilled whiskey, and the unwashed desperation of 10,000 men looking to strike it rich. Flora Higgins pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, keeping her eyes fixed on the muddy boardwalk. She was moving fast, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had exactly $3 to her name, a threadbare carpet bag, and a terrifying debt she had no means of paying. Her late brother, Thomas, had been a fool. He had gambled away their meager inheritance and borrowed heavily from Jeremiah Stone, a ruthless saloon owner whose business ventures operated entirely in the shadows. When Thomas died of lung fever a week ago, the debt had fallen to Flora. Stone hadn't asked for money. He had smiled, looked her up and down, and told her she could work off the $200 in the upstairs rooms of the Red Garter Saloon. She had until sundown today to turn herself over. Across town, stepping out of the assayer's office, was Kevin Montgomery. Kevin was a man built like the mountains he called home, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore buckskin and worn wool, carrying a Winchester rifle with a casual familiarity that made men on the street instinctively step out of his way. Kevin despised the town. He only came down from his high-altitude cabin twice a year for coffee, salt, and ammunition. But this trip was different. His grandfather, the stubborn patriarch Ezekiel Montgomery, had finally passed away. Ezekiel had owned 2,000 acres of prime, untouched timberland in the Silver Pine Valley land Kevin had lived on and managed his entire adult life. But Horace Pendleton, the stiff-collared town lawyer, had just delivered a maddening blow. "The will is ironclad, Kevin," Pendleton had said, adjusting his spectacles. Ezekiel stated, "You are too wild, a feral hermit," to use his exact phrasing. "The land only passes to you if you prove you are civilized enough to build a community. You must present a legal wife to me by the end of the month, or the deed goes to the State Railroad Consortium." Kevin had stormed out, fury radiating from him in waves. Mary, he hadn't spoken more than 10 words to a woman in 5 years. He valued silence, the wind in the pines, and his solitude above all else. As Kevin cut through a narrow, shadow-drenched alley to reach the livery stables, he heard the sharp sound of tearing fabric, followed by a muffled cry. He paused, his hand dropping naturally to the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. Down the alley, 3 men had a woman backed against a pile of discarded whiskey barrels. Flora was fighting fiercely, kicking out and swinging her carpet bag, but one of the men, a brute named Caleb, who worked as Stone's enforcer, had her by the wrists. "Come on now, little bird," Caleb sneered. "Mr. Stone is waiting. Don't make us carry you." "Let go of me!" Flora gasped, twisting desperately. Kevin didn't think. He simply moved. In 3 long strides, he was behind Caleb. He grabbed the back of the man's greasy collar, hoisted him off his feet, and threw him with bone-crushing force into the brick wall of the adjacent building. Caleb slumped to the mud, unconscious before he landed. The other 2 men spun around, reaching for their irons, but froze. Kevin already had his Colt drawn, the hammer pulled back with a terrifyingly loud click. "I prefer my alleys quiet," Kevin rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Walk away." The men looked at the giant, looked at his gun, and scrambled over their fallen friend, dragging him away as they fled toward the main street. Flora leaned against the barrels, chest heaving, her auburn hair falling out of its pins. She looked up at her savior. He was terrifying, imposing, and completely still. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice trembling. They were taking me to Jeremiah Stone." Kevin holstered his weapon, his cold blue eyes studying her. He took in her frayed dress, her pale, frightened face, and the desperate grip she had on her cheap bag. The gears in his mind, usually focused on weather patterns and tracking game, suddenly shifted. He looked at her not as a damsel in distress, but as a potential solution. "You owe Stone money?" Kevin asked bluntly. Flora blinked, taken aback by the directness. My late brother did. $200. I don't have it. I was trying to sneak out of town on the afternoon stagecoach, but they found me." Kevin nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch, tossing it into the air and catching it. "I have $200. I'll buy your debt from Stone today." Flora stiffened, her gratitude instantly turning to renewed panic. "I am not a woman for sale, mister. If you think I am going to trade one terrible master for another—" "Quiet down," Kevin interrupted, holding up a massive, calloused hand. "I don't want to buy you. I want to hire you." He motioned toward the quieter end of the alley, leading her toward a dilapidated awning where they could speak without being overheard. "My name is Kevin Montgomery. I live 3 days' ride from here, up in the Bitterroots. I have a problem. I stand to lose my family's land because my grandfather's will dictates I must be married to inherit it. I need a piece of paper and a woman standing next to me in front of the town lawyer to prove I'm a settled man." Flora stared at him, trying to comprehend. "You want me to marry you?" "I want you to pretend to be my wife," Kevin corrected, his tone flat and businesslike. "We go to a magistrate today. We sign the papers. I pay off Jeremiah Stone, clearing your name. Then you ride up the mountain with me. You stay for 1 year. Once the deed is permanently in my name, I'll give you $500 and annul the marriage. You can go wherever you want, a rich, free woman." Flora's mind raced. $500 was a fortune. It was a new life in San Francisco or Chicago. But a year in the wilderness alone with this giant. "What are the expectations?" she asked, her voice steadying. "Of a wife?" Kevin leaned in, his expression hardening into something fiercely resolute. "That is the crux of it, miss. There is only one condition. We are husband and wife on paper only. Up on that mountain, you are a boarder. I don't want a real marriage. I don't want conversation. I don't want a companion. And I certainly don't want physical entanglement. We sleep in separate spaces. No expectations. No touching. We stay out of each other's way until the year is up." Flora searched his eyes. She saw no lust, no predatory gleam, only a deep, entrenched desire to be left alone. She looked back toward the street, where she knew Stone's men would soon be returning with reinforcements. She had no other choice. "My name is Flora Higgins," she said, extending a shaking, gloved hand. "And I accept your condition, Mr. Montgomery." Kevin looked at her hand, but didn't take it. "Good. Let's go see a judge." The wedding took exactly 4 minutes. Judge Harrison, smelling strongly of peppermint and stale gin, stamped the marriage certificate and slid it across his chaotic desk. Kevin handed Flora a plain, slightly tarnished brass ring he had purchased from a pawnbroker for 20 cents. She slipped it onto her finger. It was cold and heavy. True to his word, Kevin marched straight into the Red Garter saloon, leaving Flora waiting by the horses. He emerged 10 minutes later, his knuckles slightly bruised, holding the canceled promissory note bearing her brother's forged signature. He handed it to her, mounted his massive roan gelding, and gestured for her to climb onto the sturdy mare he had bought for her. "We ride hard," was all he said. The 3-day journey up into the Bitterroots tested every ounce of Flora's endurance. The muddy, crowded roads of Leadville quickly gave way to narrow, treacherous trails carved into the sides of sheer cliffs. The air grew thin and biting. Kevin spoke only to issue commands about where to cross a stream or how to angle her horse on a steep incline. At night, they camped under the vast, terrifyingly empty canvas of the sky. Kevin slept on one side of the fire, his rifle across his chest. Flora slept on the other, shivering despite the heavy wool blankets he provided. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they broke through a dense stand of ancient Douglas firs into a clearing. Nestled against the side of a massive granite rock face was a large, sturdy log cabin. It had a stone chimney smoking gently, a wide porch, and a heavy oak door. It was isolated, wild, and incredibly beautiful. "We're here," Kevin announced, dismounting and taking her horse's reins. Inside, the cabin was remarkably clean but entirely masculine. The walls were adorned with hunting traps, pelts, and tools. There was a large central hearth, a heavy wooden dining table, and a cast-iron stove. Above, accessible by a sturdy wooden ladder, was a spacious loft. "The loft is yours," Kevin told her, carrying her carpet bag up the ladder and dropping it on the thick bear rug that served as a floor covering beside a small bed frame. "I sleep down here by the fire. There's dried meat in the larder, flour in the barrels. Water is from the pump outside. I hunt and chop wood from dawn until dusk. Keep the place tidy if you want, or don't. It doesn't matter to me." And just like that, their bizarre domestic life began. The first month was a masterclass in avoidance. True to his one strict condition, Kevin treated Flora like a ghost that happened to share his living space. He woke before the sun, leaving the cabin smelling of dark coffee and wood smoke. He would return after dark, exhausted, eat whatever Flora had prepared, offering a curt nod as thanks and retreat to his corner to clean his rifles or carve wood. Flora, desperate to feel useful and stave off the crushing loneliness of the mountain, threw herself into domestic work. She scrubbed the floors, mended his torn shirts when he left them out, and learned to bake bread in the temperamental iron stove. She watched him secretly. She watched the way his massive shoulders bunched when he swung the axe, the way the sunlight caught the golden threads in his dark beard, the surprising gentleness with which he handled his horses. She felt safe for the first time in years, but the absolute lack of human connection was starting to wear on her. It was as if an invisible glass wall separated the cabin right down the middle. The shift happened in late November, during the season's first major blizzard. The storm hit suddenly, a howling wall of white that dropped the temperature by 40 degrees in an hour. Kevin was out checking his trap lines. Flora, terrified he would freeze, kept the fire roaring and paced the floor. When the door finally burst open, Kevin stumbled in, coated in a thick crust of ice, breathing hard. "Storm's worse than I thought," he grunted, forcing the heavy door shut against the howling wind. "We're snowed in for a few days." The forced proximity changed the air in the cabin. There was no escaping to the woods for Kevin, no pretending she wasn't there. For 2 days, the tension crackled between them, thick and suffocating. Flora caught him staring at her while she knitted by the fire. When she looked up, he would immediately snap his gaze away, his jaw clenched tight. On the morning of the third day, the wind died down, though the snow was piled 4 feet high against the windows. The firewood inside was running dangerously low. "I'll get more from the shed," Kevin said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Let me help," Flora offered, eager for any activity. She grabbed her shawl before he could protest and followed him out onto the covered porch. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Kevin was already at the woodpile at the edge of the porch, loading logs into his arms. Flora hurried forward to grab some kindling. She didn't see the patch of black ice that had formed near the steps. Her worn boots hit the ice, and her feet flew out from under her. She let out a sharp cry, bracing for the bone-breaking impact of the frozen ground. It never came. Kevin dropped his armload of wood with a deafening clatter. He moved with impossible speed, his massive arms wrapping around her waist and catching her just inches from the ground. The force of his movement brought her flush against his chest. Time stopped. Flora was paralyzed, not by the cold, but by the sheer, burning heat radiating from him. His arms were like bands of iron around her, holding her so tight she could feel the heavy, frantic pounding of his heart through his layers of wool and leather. She looked up, her face inches from his. His blue eyes, usually so cold and distant, were blown wide, dark, and filled with something wild and desperate. For a single, suspended second, neither of them moved. She could feel his warm breath ghosting across her frozen cheek. She felt an overwhelming, terrifying urge to lean in, to press her face into the crook of his neck. His hands flexed against her waist, his fingers digging slightly into the fabric of her dress, as if pulling her closer against his own will. Then, as if he had been burned, Kevin violently shoved himself backward. He set her on her feet so abruptly she stumbled. He took 3 large steps back, his chest heaving, a look of profound anger directed entirely at himself washing over his face. The glass wall he had built between them had cracked, and they both knew it. "Stay inside, Flora," Kevin growled, his voice rougher and deeper than she had ever heard it. He refused to look her in the eyes. "Don't make me break my own rules just to keep you alive." He turned sharply, grabbing the axe, and began violently hacking at a frozen log, leaving Flora standing on the porch, her skin burning where he had touched her, realizing with a jolt of terror that she didn't want him to let go. The incident on the porch shattered the fragile, silent ecosystem of the cabin. For the next 2 months, Kevin Montgomery became a ghost of the timberline. He spent his days miles away from the homestead, tracking elk through waist-deep snow, returning only long after the sun had dipped below the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. When he was inside, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with an unspoken, terrifying awareness. Flora tried to maintain the boundary. She busied herself with mending, baking, and reading a dog-eared volume of poetry she had found on a dusty shelf. But every time the wind howled against the heavy oak door, her eyes darted to the window, her heart clenching with worry for the stubborn mountain man. The harsh winter finally exacted its toll in late January. It started as a dry cough, something Flora tried to muffle into her woolen shawl so as not to disturb Kevin. But within 48 hours, the cough had evolved into a rattling, agonizing chest cold. Mountain fever. The old miners in Leadville called it a sudden, brutal sickness that routinely claimed the lives of the strongest men. On a Tuesday evening, Kevin returned to a dark, freezing cabin. The fire had died to mere embers. "Flora?" he called out, his voice sharp with immediate panic. He dropped his rifle and strode across the room. He found her curled on the floor near the hearth, the broom abandoned beside her. She was violently shivering, her skin pale and slick with a terrifying, unnatural sweat. Her lips were tinged blue, and her breathing was shallow and erratic. "God Almighty," Kevin breathed. He scooped her up effortlessly, his previous rules of distance vanishing in the face of her perilous fragility. He carried her not to the loft, but to his own heavy timber bed near the fire. "Kevin," she mumbled, her eyes glassy and unseeing. "It's so cold. The stagecoach. We missed the stagecoach to Denver." "You're not in Denver, Flora. You're safe," he rasped, his massive hands trembling as he pulled the thick bear furs over her. For 3 days and 3 nights, Kevin waged war against the fever. He didn't sleep. He kept the iron stove glowing red-hot, boiling snow to make willow bark tea a remedy taught to him by Ute trackers years ago. He bathed her burning forehead with cool cloths, his large, calloused fingers moving with agonizing gentleness against her delicate skin. On the 3rd night, the fever broke, leaving Flora completely exhausted but lucid. The cabin was sweltering. Kevin was sitting in a wooden chair pulled close to the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He looked utterly defeated. Flora shifted, the rustle of the furs catching his attention. His head snapped up. His eyes, rimmed with red, met hers. "You're awake?" he said, the gruffness of his voice unable to mask the profound relief trembling beneath it. "You stayed," she whispered, her throat raw. Kevin leaned forward. The invisible wall he had so painstakingly built and maintained was pulverized. He reached out, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before his knuckles brushed against her cheek. Her skin was cool, finally free of the burning heat. "I thought I was going to lose you," he admitted, the confession costing him dearly. "I've faced grizzlies and blizzards, Flora, but watching you fade, it nearly killed me." Flora looked up at the fierce, untamed man who had saved her twice now. She didn't see a feral hermit. She saw a man with a heart so fiercely protective it terrified him to use it. Slowly, weakly, she reached up and placed her hand over his, pressing his palm fully against her cheek. A ragged groan tore from Kevin's throat. The ironclad control he had wielded for months completely snapped. He slid from the chair onto his knees beside the bed. He leaned in, his face hovering inches from hers, his gaze dropping to her lips. "My one condition," he murmured, his breath fanning across her face, "was that I wouldn't touch you, that I wouldn't want you." "Break it," she breathed. Kevin closed the distance. His mouth captured hers, not with the brutal force one might expect from a mountain man, but with a desperate, starving reverence. It was a taste of rain and wood smoke, of fierce protection and overwhelming desire. Flora tangled her fingers in his thick hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. When he finally pulled away, his chest was heaving, his forehead resting against hers. Having a taste of her didn't satisfy the hunger. It only made him realize he could never, ever let her go. The paper marriage had vanished in the firelight. She was his wife, in every sense of the word, and he would burn the world down before he let her leave. Spring came to the Bitterroots with a violent, beautiful urgency. The snowmelt turned the mountain streams into roaring torrents of white water, and the high meadows exploded in a riot of purple columbine and yellow balsam root. Inside the cabin, the thaw was equally absolute. The separate beds were a thing of the past. Kevin and Flora moved around each other with a quiet, powerful intimacy. He would wrap his arms around her waist from behind while she cooked, burying his face in her neck. She would sit on the porch steps and watch him chop wood, no longer hiding her admiration. They had crossed a threshold, bound not by Horace Pendleton's legal document, but by a genuine, deep-rooted love. But as the valley blossomed, a dark cloud was gathering in the lowlands. It was mid-May when the past arrived on horseback. Kevin was a mile up the ridge, clearing deadfall from the upper pasture, leaving Flora at the cabin to tend to the small garden she had started. She was pulling weeds when the sound of snapping twigs made her stand up, wiping soil from her hands. 3 riders broke through the tree line. The blood drained from Flora's face. Leading the pack was Jeremiah Stone. He looked entirely out of place in the pristine wilderness, wearing a tailored city suit, a bowler hat, and a smug, predatory smile. Flanking him were 2 heavily armed men, including Caleb, the brute Kevin had thrown against the brick wall months ago. Caleb's nose was now permanently crooked, and his eyes burned with malice when he spotted her. "Well, well," Stone called out, pulling his fine black stallion to a halt near the porch. "If it isn't the little runaway bird, you've built yourself quite a nest up here, Miss Higgins." "It's Mrs. Montgomery now," Flora said, forcing her voice to remain steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She slowly backed toward the open cabin door, calculating the distance to Kevin's spare Winchester hanging over the mantel. "Is it?" Stone chuckled, dismounting. He tapped his riding crop against his leather boots. "I had my associates in Denver do a little digging. Turns out your sudden nuptials are the talk of the town, especially since the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad just announced their plans to lay a new spur straight through the Silver Pine Valley. Suddenly, this worthless patch of timber is worth tens of thousands of dollars to the right buyer." Flora stopped. Kevin had never mentioned the railroad. "This land belongs to my husband. According to Ezekiel Montgomery's will, it belongs to Kevin only if he remains legally and happily married for a year," Stone corrected smoothly, stepping onto the porch. "And I happen to know your marriage is a sham. A business transaction I inadvertently financed. If I bring the town magistrate up here and you admit this is a fraud, the land reverts to the state, and my associates at the railroad purchase it for pennies." "I will admit no such thing," Flora said fiercely. Stone's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian glare. "You will, Flora, because if you don't, Caleb here is going to drag you back to Leadville, where you will work off your brother's debt in my saloon, just as we originally agreed. And your husband will suffer a tragic hunting accident." "The only accident here is you stepping onto my property, Stone." The voice boomed from the edge of the clearing like a thunderclap. Jeremiah Stone spun around. Kevin Montgomery was standing at the tree line. He hadn't ridden down. He had moved through the forest silently on foot. He looked like an avenging spirit of the mountain. His heavy Sharps buffalo rifle was leveled directly at Stone's chest. Caleb and the other hired gun went for their holsters. "I wouldn't," Kevin warned, his voice deadly calm. "I can put a .50 caliber slug through Stone's heart before your guns clear leather, and then I'll gut the both of you with my hunting knife. Drop them." The hired men froze, looking at their boss. Kevin's reputation as a feral, dangerous man was well known in the camps below. The terrifying stillness in his posture proved the rumors true. "Do as he says," Stone hissed, his arrogant facade cracking. The men slowly drew their revolvers with 2 fingers and dropped them into the dirt. Kevin walked forward, his eyes never leaving the saloon owner. He stepped onto the porch, placing his large frame entirely between Flora and the men. The protective energy radiating from him was palpable. "I paid her debt," Kevin stated, stopping just 3 feet from Stone. "I bought the note. Flora owes you nothing." "You bought a fraudulent note to secure a fraudulent marriage," Stone sneered, trying to regain his composure. "You think Pendleton won't see right through this? You bought a whore to save your trees, Montgomery." The movement was so fast, Flora barely registered it. Kevin didn't shoot. He dropped the rifle, lunged forward, and wrapped his massive hand around Stone's throat, lifting the man clean off his boots. Stone's eyes bugged out, his hands clawing uselessly at Kevin's iron grip. "Listen to me very carefully, you parasitic rat," Kevin snarled, his face inches from the choking man. "She is my wife. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of God, and in the eyes of any man foolish enough to question it, you will ride back to Leadville. You will tell the railroad to route their tracks through the canyon, and if I ever see your shadow on my mountain again, I won't bother warning you. I'll bury you where you stand." He threw Stone backward off the porch. The saloon owner landed hard in the dirt, gasping for air, his fine suit ruined. "Get out," Kevin commanded. Stone scrambled to his feet, coughing violently. He practically threw himself onto his horse. Caleb and the other man didn't wait for orders. They were already mounted and wheeling their horses around. Within seconds, they were galloping desperately back down the trail, disappearing into the dense timber. Kevin stood on the porch, his chest rising and falling heavily, watching the tree line until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. Then he turned to Flora. The terrifying, violent mountain man vanished, replaced by a look of profound vulnerability. "Did he hurt you?" Kevin asked, reaching out to gently cup her face. "No," Flora said, leaning into his touch, her adrenaline finally crashing. She wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, pressing her ear to his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "Kevin, what he said about the railroad, is it true?" Kevin sighed, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "I got a letter from Pendleton at the assayer's office a month ago. The railroad wants the valley. That's why my grandfather put the marriage clause in the will. He knew the only way to hold them off was to prove the land was settled by a family, not just a lone squatter." He pulled back slightly, looking deeply into her eyes. The fear of losing her first to the fever, and now to the ghosts of her past, had stripped away any remaining pride or hesitation. "Flora, the year is up in 4 months," Kevin said quietly. "When I made the bargain, I fully intended to hand you $500 and send you away. But I was a fool." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cheap brass ring she wore, the one he had bought for 20 cents. He gently took her left hand. "I don't want you to pretend anymore," Kevin said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want you to leave. I want to build a real house, a real life. I want to spend the rest of my days on this mountain with you. Be my real wife, Flora." Tears spilled over Flora's eyelashes. The frightened, indebted girl who had cowered in a muddy alley in Leadville was gone. In her place was a woman who had fought the winter, fought the wilderness, and won the heart of the fiercest man she had ever known. "I already am, Kevin," she whispered, pulling him down for a kiss. "I already am." October of 1883 painted the Colorado high country in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. Exactly 1 year to the day since they had stood in the muddy alleyway, Kevin and Flora rode back into the chaotic sprawl of Leadville. The mining camp had swelled into a proper city, its wooden boardwalks replaced by brick and the air thick with the smoke of progress. But neither Kevin nor Flora paid any mind to the bustling streets. Their focus was entirely on the sharp-peaked roof of Horace Pendleton's law office. Kevin helped Flora down from her mare. He wore a clean wool suit that stretched tight across his broad shoulders, while Flora wore a beautifully tailored forest green riding habit she had sewn herself over the winter. She was no longer the fragile, terrified girl who had fled her brother's debts. Her posture was straight, her skin kissed by the mountain sun, and her eyes held the steady, unyielding calm of the wilderness. Kevin took her hand, his thumb brushing over the new, solid gold band that sat beside the cheap brass ring he had given her a year ago. They walked into the law office together. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the street. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Horace Pendleton sat behind his massive desk, his spectacles perched on his nose. But they were not alone. Sitting in the leather wingback chairs opposite the desk were two men. One was Jeremiah Stone, wearing a smug, triumphant grin. The other was a sharp-featured man in an expensive Eastern suit, Thaddeus Bancroft, a senior land acquisition agent for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," Pendleton greeted, his voice tight. "You are just in time. Mr. Stone and Mr. Bancroft were just presenting a rather troubling petition to the court." Kevin stepped forward, pulling Flora slightly behind him, his jaw clenching. "Stone has no business here, Horace. The debt was paid." "This isn't about the debt, Montgomery," Stone sneered, standing up and smoothing his waistcoat. "It's about fraud, Mr. Bancroft here represents the interests of the railroad and, by extension, the economic future of Colorado. We have filed a formal objection to the transfer of the Silver Pine Valley deed. We have sworn affidavits from 3 men who observed your cabin this spring. They swear under oath that your marriage is a complete sham, a business arrangement designed solely to steal land that rightfully belongs to the state." Thaddeus Bancroft stood, opening a leather satchel. "The law is clear, Mr. Montgomery. The late Ezekiel Montgomery stipulated that you must be in a genuine, functioning matrimonial union. Living as estranged boarders to cheat the system invalidates the will. We are prepared to offer the estate $2,000 for the valley, and Mr. Stone has generously offered to drop the perjury charges against your companion." Kevin's hands curled into massive fists. The urge to drag Stone out into the street and finish what he had started months ago was a fiery ache in his chest. But before he could take a step, Flora moved. She stepped out from behind her husband, her chin held high, and walked directly to Pendleton's desk. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, slamming it down on the polished wood with a loud crack. "Those affidavits are the lies of a man who was thrown off our porch for trespassing," Flora stated, her voice ringing clear and authoritative through the room. She opened the ledger. "Mr. Pendleton, you require proof of a functioning union. Look at these pages. These are the daily accounts of the Silver Pine homestead for the past 365 days. You will see my handwriting detailing the sale of timber, the purchase of winter stores, and the exact count of the livestock my husband and I raised together." She slammed her bare hands down on the desk next to the book. "Look at my hands, Mr. Pendleton. These are not the hands of a woman hiding in a loft. I have chopped wood, I have hauled water, and I nearly died of mountain fever alongside that man. We did not build a fraud, we built a home," Stone scoffed. "Calluses and a ledger do not prove a marriage, you foolish girl." Kevin moved then, placing a heavy hand on Flora's shoulder. The fierce pride in his eyes was blinding. He looked at Pendleton. "Horace," Kevin rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "My grandfather thought I was too wild to keep that land. He thought I needed a tether. He was right. But I didn't find a tether. I found a partner. If you want to take the land and give it to the railroad, you do it. I will pack our wagon tonight, and we will ride north to Montana. Because the dirt and the timber mean absolutely nothing to me without my wife. I don't need Ezekiel's deed to prove what she is to me." The room fell dead silent. Bancroft looked suddenly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the towering mountain man and the fierce woman at his side. Horace Pendleton slowly took off his spectacles. He looked at the ledger, looked at Flora's calloused hands, and finally met Kevin's steady gaze. The old lawyer let out a long, heavy sigh and picked up his pen. "Ezekiel Montgomery was a stubborn, paranoid old fool," Pendleton said quietly. "But he told me, right before he died, that I would know if you had actually changed. He said, 'Kevin will only fight for something if he truly loves it. If he's willing to walk away from the mountain for her, give him the deed.'" Stone's face turned purple. "Now see here, Pendleton, this is an outrage. The railroad." "The railroad will have to go through the canyon, Mr. Bancroft," Pendleton interrupted, dipping his pen in the inkwell and signing the bottom of a heavy parchment document with a flourish. He stamped it with the county seal and slid it across the desk toward Flora. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, Pendleton said, a rare smile touching his lips. Silver Pine Valley is yours, free and clear. Kevin didn't look at Stone or Bancroft as they stormed out of the office in a cloud of furious indignation. He only looked at Flora. He pulled her into his arms right there in the law office, burying his face in her auburn hair, breathing in the scent of pine and lavender that had become his entire world. The bargain was dead. The boundaries were broken. They were finally, completely going home. The forged signatures and cold bargains of Leadville faded into memory, replaced by the enduring warmth of the Silver Pine Valley. Kevin and Flora Montgomery built an empire not of railroad steel, but of timber, devotion, and unbroken promises. The mountain man who demanded absolute distance ultimately surrendered to the one woman brave enough to cross the divide, proving that the wildest hearts love the fiercest.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, Pretend to be my wife, a mountain man said, but having a taste of her broke his one condition. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me in this story was how quickly emotions can grow when two people start lowering the walls they built around themselves. Beneath the tension and attraction, there's also vulnerability, trust, and the fear of getting attached when life has taught you to stay guarded. I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, even outside of romance. Do you think relationships built on unexpected situations can become something real over time? And when someone tries so hard not to fall for another person, does that usually make the feeling stronger? Stories like this remind me that sometimes the connections we never planned for are the ones that change us the most. If this story gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional mountain man stories with complicated relationships and heartfelt moments, feel free to like and subscribe for more.